So the trauma bond has so many different variations and faces. Let's talk about the anger and self-loathing trauma bond. The trauma bond is generally created by an alternation and vacillation going between periods of normal and unhealthy. And these backs and forths can be between really good and bad. A fun partner where you have some good days, for example, alternating with them cheating or just being an overall a-hole. Or between normal and bad. Nothing fancy, but just a normal-ish person, but then who will fly into rages or give you the silent treatment for things that they weren't raging about the day before. Or the trauma bond may be a vacillation between bad and really bad. A relationship that never feels good, but some days they actually don't yell and humiliate you, and other days they do. The trauma bond comes from a place of attempting to make an attachment to an unstable person or situation. And so typically, like I said, it quite often happens in childhood. It can, and that's where it's most pronounced. In adult relationships, it can happen as well. And it always creates a sense of cognitive dissonance. And we make excuses to reduce that tension, and then we get stuck. But there is another darker twist on the trauma bond that I don't talk about enough, but some of you may be experiencing. In my healing program recently, we finished a month on anger, right? The anger anyone who has been in a narcissistic relationship experiences when they think about the relationship, right? Anger is not just a narcissist game. We feel anger too. These relationships make us angry, right? But they're not safe spaces in which to share our anger. In fact, we may not even know how to express our anger. And on top of that, we are often quite unsettled by the narcissistic person's anger. So it becomes a very fraught space. But we do get angry in these relationships and may often keep it bottled up for a long time. So we may find that when we do finally express it, a lot comes out, and we are also finding ourselves a bit explosive. We're feeling explosive instead of just the narcissistic person, or just anger finally just comes out, and that we find ourselves responding to the injustice and the betrayal and the manipulations, and so we may engage in angry behavior too. And that is when we get into a different kind of cycle. I was fielding a question from a few people recently about their own anger. People who say, I get angry. I sometimes actually really react strongly, and I say angry things, or I raise my voice. And then the narcissistic person, not surprisingly, reacts back, and we go back and forth. And these are people who said, it isn't me to get this frothed up. But they also shared that they struggle with the relationship. They want to get out. They can't get out for a variety of reasons. However, something really driving the stuck trauma-bonded cycle is that they feel that they are now part of the problem because they are also the angry one. And then they slip into thinking that, well, maybe I'm just as bad as them. And then the slippery slope of, well, I can't manage my anger either. I need to work on it becomes an issue. And while healthy anger expression is a great thing for all of us to learn, you can see how the perception that you have an anger problem is what may keep you stuck in an unhealthy relationship where you are being chronically baited and betrayed and humiliated. But the anger trauma bond, as it were, feels a little different because even other people witnessing your relationship may write it off as two volatile people in a relationship. In people who are in narcissistic relationships, who do readily express their anger in the relationship, there may be another sticky cycle where you get angry in the relationship and then you apologize, angry, apologize, angry, apologize. And it's just that cycle creates a sort of trauma-bonded cement because you do constantly feel bad for relating your anger. You're told by the narcissistic person in the relationship you're doing a bad thing, and then you express your anger, which may look bad. So for people who are stuck in these angry, trauma-bonded cycles, it can be even more difficult to unstuck because you feel you're part of the problem, really, in a significant way. And when a narcissistic person demonstrates their anger, they feel entitled to that anger. If they ever apologize, which is rare, the apologies will be hollow. They don't learn. The narcissistic person has no empathy for how this anger has affected the other person. And when a person who is not narcissistic shows that anger, they may feel overwhelmed, they may apologize and feel guilty for a long time. They don't feel entitled to that anger and are often quite ashamed by it. And you may worry and ruminate about how your anger hurt other people, ultimately feeling like a bad person for expressing the anger the way you did. We often have a template, this idea that a survivor of a narcissistic relationship is someone who is broken down by the ongoing manipulation and invalidation and shaming and gaslighting and betrayal. Many survivors are overregulated, they're numb, they're mildly dissociated. They don't express negative emotions, not sadness or anger or anything. You don't express your needs. And so that template of a survivor, overregulated, not showing emotion, we're actually hoping to see more emotion, doesn't always reconcile with this idea of someone who might be in a narcissistic relationship, being harmed in all the ways, but someone who also expresses their anger, fights back a little bit. And the fight response is a standard sympathetic nervous system response. Because anger is such a central part of the presentation of a narcissistic person, it is not unusual for people who do express anger, despite also being narcissistically abused, to wonder, I must be narcissistic too, or at least a lot like them. So you can imagine that this response would result in a person sometimes just thinking that they are part of the problem, as I said, and not getting the support and help that they need. Anger by itself is not the problem. Anger becomes a problem depending on how it's expressed and how it's regulated, and also how we manage the aftermath after we do express anger. It's also recognizing that there are things in life that are angering: injustice, breaches of trust, betrayal, insults, gaslighting. So when they happen, it is only natural that we would respond angrily. Unfortunately, then the standard advice is, well, then get out if you're always feeling so angry. If this person keeps doing hurtful stuff, try and communicate, which is obviously not an option. And then, sadly, most people will still blame the person who is having the bad things happen to them because they're angry. And since leaving is often not an option, things that make you angry will likely keep happening in this relationship, and then the lion's share of regulating the anger is on you. People who are in these relationships who do respond with anger, it's not abnormal, and as I say, often results in this ongoing anger apology cycle. But this group of folks who does express or do express anger often gets lost in the conversation when we're talking about narcissistic abuse, because the people who respond with anger are often critiqued for how they are sharing or managing their anger. And then the work goes to the anger. We focus on the anger of the person who's actually being hurt by the toxic dynamics, which is fine, but it can't be the sole focus. In some ways, having some anger about what is happening in the narcissistic relationship is a good thing. It's a recognition of the injustice and the harm, and that's good. It fosters the radical acceptance and the other shifts that are needed for healing. But breaking out of the cycle of, well, maybe I'm the problem and I'm the angry person, can really make the trauma-bonded cycle significantly harder to break. In narcissistic relationships, expressed anger, the anger you show, doesn't tend to work in the long term, largely because it creates a perpetual cycle. They keep doing invalidating things. You respond with anger, back and forth forever. And it often escalates. So it then becomes a mix of things. Seeing the relationship clearly, understanding that while feeling angry makes sense, It becomes about finding new ways to express it. It becomes about disengagement and radical acceptance and then figuring out next steps. But if you see this pattern in yourself, and especially if you sense it is bleeding into other places, for example, you find yourself just generally feeling angry most of the time, or a general sense of irritability, or that your fuse is getting shorter and shorter with people who aren't doing the things that the narcissistic person is doing, or that your anger is just getting more and more reactive, then seeking out help and self-awareness become absolutely key. Anger, as I said, is a normal emotion, but in a narcissistic relationship, it gets very messy. It's a part of grief, it's a part of depression, and it is definitely a part of the process of being in a narcissistic relationship. But getting clear on it so you don't get into a sticky, superglued trauma bond that is harder to get out of than most becomes crucial. And then take that anger and see if you can channel it in ways that are good or at least better for you. The narcissistic relationship often brings up anger because we are powerless and helpless. Anger is a reminder that it is not a good feeling, but it all comes down to finding those ways to express it. The feeling is fine. Again, it's the expression that matters. A person can be angry and empathic and self-aware and not entitled and not grandiose and not manipulative. Keep that clear for yourself and recognize that most of us feel angry in these relationships, but we often suppress it, and that's not good for us either. Thanks again.